Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM Channel 141. This is the Insight segment. I'm Harold Fisher. Tonight on the Daily Drum, crucial workplace issues to watch in 2025. With just a week to go before President-elect Donald Trump takes office, uncertainty looms over what changes might come across various sectors. My guest is Tom Spiegel, employment attorney and founder of the Spiegel Law Firm. Tonight, he'll highlight the potential for significant shifts in public policy that could impact workers and employers alike. And he says there are 5 key areas to keep an eye on this year. He is also author of You're Pregnant, You're Fired, and Fired or Afraid You Might Be. Both of those titles very intriguing and appropriate for this conversation. Mr. Spiegel, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely thrilled to be here. And I just want to add, you can find both those books on my website or on Amazon. So,
what's the website? Is that spiegellaw.com?
Exactly, spiegellaw.com.
Okay, it's like wiggle, but with an S.
With an SP.
That's right. SP. There you go. Thank you so much. Let's talk first of all about some of the 5 workplace issues that could be challenging in 2025 under a new Trump administration. We can go through those issues kind of one by one, whether it be for employees, employers, or both. I think the first one, the big one, unionization. We know that President Biden was a big supporter of unions. We saw him during the auto workers strike, very vocal, walking and talking with them and supporting those auto workers. But those changes could be rolled back.
That's right. We'll see. I mean, I think the interesting thing is that, of course, during his administration, during his campaign, there was a fair amount of pro-worker rhetoric, at least. So we'll see how it actually shakes out. But certainly, if we look back to his first term in 2016, it was not a good time for labor unions. The federal body that oversees union activities and some non-union activities is the National Labor Relations Board, which enforces the National Labor Relations Act, which governs the right of employees to unionize, everything from, workplace conduct to how to give notice of a union, to how, what employers can do while the campaign is ongoing. There are a number of very detailed issues that come up in union matters. And again, the National Labor Relations Board also deals with some speech in the workplace for both union and non-union workers. So, it's called concerted activity. So if you engage in concerted activity, it's protected, should be in the workplace. And so we've seen this for private sector folks who are not in a union. For instance, if you want to talk about pay issues, if you want to talk about workplace, even if you don't do it in the best way, let's say, you post in a company Facebook group like, hey, this place stinks and I don't think I'm paid enough. That's arguably concerted activity because you're talking about workplace issues. And so I think we will see a rightward tilt that's toward business in the National Labor Relations Board. There's already some indications that he's going to act very quickly to put his people in place in the National Labor Relations Board. And we'll see, how they start to define issues. For example, like you can make concerted activity a broad definition or a narrow definition. You can make it easy for folks to unionize. You can make it difficult for folks to unionize. And I think we're going to see, if I'm a betting man, that generally it's going to be a pro-business tilt, which means that unions are potentially going to have less power, certainly going to have more difficulty unionizing, and we may see less robust protections for people who are not unionized, who had been protected under the National Labor Relations Act.
When you say fewer protections for non-union workers, what do you mean?
So the Section 7 of the National Labor Relations Act applies to, because the National Labor Relations Act and the board is mostly focused on union activities. but Section 7 applies to union and non-union folks alike, but partly because the idea is, you need to be, in order to have unions, you have to protect the precursor activities to unionization. When the first one is like somebody standing up and saying, hey, this stinks, these workplace issues are terrible, or we're not getting paid, or it's unsafe, or whatever it may be. And so, so the board does have authority over that kind of speech in the workplace. And we could see them take a more narrow view of what constitutes concerted activity. There was a bunch of activity, and we will probably talk about this later, but with non-competes, right? Like requiring, these employees to sign non-competes when they start with the company or when they leave. The National Labor Relations Board under the Biden administration took a dim view of non-competes and said they were anti-competitive. I think we will see a rollback of that kind of positioning. So those kinds of, we'll see. Well, may it be a sea change, perhaps, but I think we're definitely going to see a narrowing. Whereas under the Biden administration, they're trying to pull more people under the tent, give more people protection under the National Labor Relations Act. I think under Trump, we're going to see that circle constrict. And so fewer people are going to be protected. Unions are going to have fewer activity protections. And under Section 7, even non-union people, again, the protections won't completely go away, but I think we're going to see a much more narrow view of what constitutes concerted activity. And then I think even with enforcement provisions, right? Because it's one thing, for the National Labor Relations Board to take a position on something. It's another thing for them to take action against an employer by suing them or taking some kind of administrative action. I think we'll see a lot less of that.
One more question on this union thing, because anyone who has even peripherally been paying attention to labor-related or union news has seen individual Starbucks stores and Apple stores unionize.
Yes.
What does this new administration possibly portend for those who have unionized in what would may be considered, non-traditional workplaces?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll continue to see union activity, and people who are already in a union, they may see some of their rights curtailed, but they're going to have significant protections because they've already got the collective bargaining agreement for the union that they're in. Again, like, some of the issues we talked about with concerted activity, we may see, I think it'll be more activity in who can unionize and how they're able to unionize. And I think we're going to see the NLRB put their thumb on the scale to make it more difficult, not impossible. And I think a lot of these trends that, kind of have encouraged unionization, and we've kind of seen, as you mentioned, kind of a renaissance these past number of years with union power. Those aren't going to go away, but there are going to be more hurdles in place for workers to be able to unionize.
I want to talk about probably the biggest headline that we've seen during this past presidential campaign season, as well as after the election, and that has to do with undocumented immigrants and the promise by the incoming Trump administration to deport millions of undocumented immigrants. The czar that he has appointed already has been very, very specific in that he says that, of course, they're going to look at those who have criminal records, but there are a lot of undocumented immigrants in this country who are law-abiding citizens, who pay their taxes, who are working, et cetera, et cetera. What does that look like from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's going to be pretty ugly, sadly. I think, the federal government already has a fair amount of authority to intervene in workplaces, to enforce immigration laws. And it's just a question of how robustly that's being used. And I think under, even under the Biden administration and Obama, they were using those powers. It's not as if these raids didn't happen. But now it's going to be, I think a multiple times more aggressive with, federal agents coming into the workforce, more enforcement. Again, we talked earlier just about how there's going to be less enforcement by the National Labor Relations Board and other kind of federal employment bodies, but I think we're going to see the opposite with regard to immigration issues, and with the administration at pains to review workplace records, to enforce laws that require employers to check ID and confirm citizenship before offering employment. And then, of course, just physically coming into a workplace to deport workers. So I think that's going to be, that's going to continue to be on the front page, and it's going to be very visible. And I think employers are going to have to dot all their I's and cross all their T's with regard to, hiring immigrants and whether or not they're U.S. citizens, and they should be prepared. Should be talking to their management side lawyers, their own attorneys, like what are best practices when the INS shows up on their doorstep, or some of the other federal agency shows up on their doorstep to check these records or even deport workers.
If you are an undocumented immigrant in this country, do you have rights?
You do have rights. You do still have employment law rights. For example, you're still protected under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is the big anti-discrimination law. So you're protected from discrimination in the workplace. There's some limits on the damages that you can get. I believe you can't get what's called front pay, even if you win an award, but you're still protected from discrimination, in the workplace, and you're protected by other laws as well. But in terms of your immigration status, that's a completely different story, and employment laws wouldn't necessarily impact that. I mean, I think we could see some bleed over in that. Of course, people who are here that are undocumented, run the risk of being deported. But for those people who are here legally in whatever status, everybody is protected from what's called national origin discrimination, right? Under the, at least under Title VII, which applies to workplaces with 15 or more employees. I think we could see, if things turn ugly and employers are kind of either because they're scared or, once bitten, twice shy sort of thing, taking action against people who are here legally, then we could see more claims for national origin discrimination, right? Because people are taking, again, just hypothetically, people are taking a dim view generally of folks who don't look like they're from here.
Interesting. Lots for us to get to, and I'm not quite finished with asking you about the undocumented immigrant question, because
Sure.
Certainly there are concerns from the perspective of the undocumented immigrant, but also from the perspective of those who may employ them. So we're going to get to that and many other issues. So we're going to take a quick break, but don't forget, you can hear this and every edition of the Daily Drum Insight segment via podcast on WHUR.com. That's our website. The Original Quiet Storm with Raheem Devon is next on WHUR. I'm Harold Fisher. This conversation continues on Sirius XM channel 141 and 96.3 HD2 in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on Sirius XM channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. We continue our conversation tonight about employment law and how public policy changes may affect your job. My guest tonight is Tom Spiegel. He is an employment attorney. He is also founder of the Spiegel Law Firm here in DC. And we are continuing our conversation about these shifts in public policy that could impact employers and workers. Now, before the break, Mr. Spiegel, we were talking about undocumented workers. And I guess the thing that we have also heard is that if the incoming Trump administration is able to carry out this mass deportation of those who are in the country illegally, the impact that it will have on the economy. But if we kind of zoom in for example, and look at the impact that it will have. A lot of people, if you own a home, if you have hired someone through one of the um, apps that allow people to post their businesses, landscaping, bricklaying, uh, housekeeping, just about anything that you need to have done, it is very likely that among your choices will be immigrants who are here legally or illegally. But let's just talk about those who are here and are undocumented. What impact might that have on those who employ them? And I don't mean temporarily. If I have a business, if I have Harold's lawn, landscape, and I have hired 15 or 20 undocumented workers, and my business is successful, I'm paying my taxes, et cetera, et cetera. If these raids happen, would I be in trouble?
I mean, you could be. I mean, and the regulations that apply to businesses tend to vary depending on the size of the business. Most federal regulations make some exception for, smaller businesses that don't have a big HR department, and aren't hiring, hundreds of workers at a time. But at the same time, the immigration laws apply to all employers in some respect. And if you can be shown that you knowingly, right, if the federal government can show that you knowingly hired illegal immigrants, then you could face penalties, both civil penalties and in rare instances, criminal penalties. I think those would have to be pretty serious. I mean, I think the interesting thing will be is what changes we see coming right out of the gate in the Trump administration. We've already heard, I think one Republican senator said it was going to be a shock and awe amount of executive orders coming out, within the first 100 days. And a number of those are going to deal with immigration. So they're probably going to be, and there could be changes to the INS and regulations regarding the INS. So this could be a completely different landscape, even just a few short weeks from now. So I think, employers, again, this is a good time to, if you don't have a lawyer, get one at least for this issue and review your policies. I think as long as you are making a good faith effort to make, to hire workers who are, only here legally, then the chances of you getting in serious trouble are slim. But if you've kind of gotten used to turning a blind eye because the federal government hasn't been enforcing these, it's going to be a new day. And I don't think you can count on the government to be just sort of sleepwalking through this. There's going to see a lot of activity here. So I'd make sure you're complying with all those documentation requirements, that you're doing the checks that you need to do to satisfy yourself the best that you can, and under the law that you're hiring somebody who is here legally and legally here, available to work. And it's complicated because, right? I mean, you've got people who have green cards, you've got people who have work visas, you have we've seen, right, H-1B, right? H-1B visas that was just recently in the news, which is a big issue. So it is no small feat to comply with all those regulations. And I think we're going to have a lot of busy employment and immigration lawyers in the coming weeks.
And I would also imagine, honestly, that in the example that I use, if you are a one-man shop, so to speak, and that you're the sole proprietor, but you need, two of your landscapers, they get sick or just something happens to them, and now you're asking someone else, like, do you know anyone else who has this particular skill or this bricklaying skill, whatever it happens to be. You're just trying to make ends meet. You're just trying to keep your business from falling apart. And I would imagine that there are a lot of don't ask, don't tell employers out there.
Oh, sure. Yeah, there are a lot of them. And again, I don't know that we're going to see the INS and other federal agencies, going after the small mom and pops. like they will, the bigger employers, if only because, right, that's makes for the bigger headline if you raid a big, national employer as opposed to, somebody who owns the Stop and Shop down the street. But that doesn't mean there isn't some exposure there. And again, we'll see how aggressive the administration is going to be out there. It's also then something to consider that there are going to be state laws in this regard, generally not in terms of deportation and those sorts of things, but in terms of like, we've seen Texas take some very heavy-handed approaches to this in terms of what kind of information an employer has to, share about undocumented, immigrants. And there, again, there are state agencies that have some enforcement power. So it's going to be a thicket of regulations. And again, if you're a small mom and pop, and you're making good faith efforts and you're, complying with the I-9s and the identification you need to have for those, when you hire somebody, chances are you're going to be fine. But certainly, you don't want to do anything where you are intentionally, you can be shown to be intentionally turning a blind eye and hiring somebody to be undocumented. So I think the mom and pop, there's less exposure, there's less chance you're going to get in trouble, but it's still not zero. And it's going to be a lot higher come January 20 than it was on January 19.
As it relates to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is it dead? Is it dying on the vine? What are your thoughts after the 20th?
Yeah, it's taken a hit, that's for sure. I don't think it is dead. I mean, some employers, I think perhaps who didn't like DEI initiatives in the first place are taking this opportunity to shutter those kinds of programs, but some of them aren't. Costco was just recently in the news for basically telling some of its shareholders, where they could stick it, when it came to trying to get rid of their DEI programs. So we could see some corporations saying, we're sticking to these policies because frankly, they're good for business. It's been, well researched, well shown that diversity tends to make for stronger organizations. And we are also seeing employers continue these sorts of activities, but they call it something else, right? They don't call it DEI initiatives because that's become such a buzzword. That said, I think it's going to be, one agency we haven't talked about yet is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is the federal agency that enforces most federal anti-discrimination laws. I think we're going to see from the EEOC it becoming more hostile to DEI type programs. Companies are going to have to really narrowly tailor them. And I think we're going to see some enforcement action from the EEOC in this regard, whereas we almost never saw that before. So it's not dead. It's taken a body blow. It's going to go underground in some situations. And in some companies, they're going to keep it.
Yeah. What do you think it will look like for workers who are employed by companies that are eliminating their DEI programs, policies, strategies? Will they feel it? I mean, could these things happen and they not necessarily see a change in the workplace environment?
It's possible. I mean, it depends on how aggressive the company was in using DEI initiatives in the first place. As is true with a lot of these things, sometimes it's just a brochure, right? In terms of like what's actually happening in the workplace. And for those companies, the employees may not feel much of a change, but for those employers who had been aggressively using, DEI initiatives, you could feel a change in tone, a change in culture, some change in opportunity. It's worth noting though, you're still protected, DEI initiatives or not, you're still protected by anti-discrimination laws. So it's not as if companies can now, turn around, kind of the Jim Crow era. But you could see a diminution, a real cooling in affirmative efforts to, bring more diverse, populations into the fold, kind of at the C-suite level and those with, with power within the organization. So I really think it's going to be a case by case. I think some people are definitely going to feel it though.
One of the other things, and this kind of goes to the heart of your book, You're Pregnant, You're Fired. There was a very high profile case in the District of Columbia back in 2011, where a Chipotle employee who was pregnant was fired after first revealing it and then alleging that she was treated differently. Eventually, she sued and won a settlement of $550,000 some 5 years later in 2016. That in and of itself, that was a high profile case. But going forward, there were obviously laws protecting people who were pregnant.
Yes.
In the workplace. I mean, I was about to say, well, that was a no-brainer, but if it was a no-brainer, then I guess we wouldn't have to have laws, right?
That's right. Or my book. I wouldn't have to write the book if everybody.
Right, that's right. You don't have to have laws for the obvious because you do. But even in that particular case, and I'm no lawyer, but that treatment was barred under the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978. Now, I'm not taking that off the top of my head. I wish I could, but I'm reading from my notes.
Yes.
But to that point, again, moving forward for women who are working and become pregnant, do they have to look over their shoulder going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think this is one area where there may actually be more protections for pregnant workers and for people with family responsibilities, partly because during the campaign, the emphasis on families, on childbirth, on, abortion and those sort of right to life, those sorts of issues sort of animate all this desire to protect women who are pregnant in the workplace. So I think this is one where we may see the Trump administration at least do no harm. Like, I don't think it's going to be like these other areas where they're rolling it back. And in fact, we could see them take a more aggressive stance toward enforcing pregnancy discrimination policies and laws, right? We talked about the EEOC. That has authority over the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, and a new law that came out, I think it was just this past year, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. I think we could see actually more activity in that regard. Again, we'll see if they're bringing more enforcement activity, but I think this is one group of people who actually may see their rights strengthened rather than cut down. And I think it's also worth noting that a lot of states now have passed protections for pregnant workers that are in many instances more aggressive than the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. DC being one. The DC Human Rights Act is a very powerful local law. Virginia has its own local law. Many localities do now. So I think this is one where we're one group in particular that we're going to see continue to enjoy those protections, maybe even more of them.
One of the other issues is workplace safety, whether you're talking about OSHA or other kinds of standards, big and small. One would think on the surface that having a safe business is good business, but is it possible that certain regulations, or can an argument be made for certain regulations, safety regulations, hamstringing a business? One could talk about Boeing, and we've seen what has happened to their stock since that door exploded off of the Alaska Airlines plane and the like. So I don't know, where do you think the new administration is going to be regarding these issues?
Again, I think we're going to see, a tilt toward big business again, and if not a change in regulations, then a change in enforcement. And there may be some changes in regulation. I would not be surprised. But in terms of enforcement, so if I go to OSHA now and complain about an unsafe, work condition, what does it do? Does OSHA take any action? Does it become more toothless? So again, they may not change the actual regulations, but they may change the enforcement stance so that, yes, there are violations of the regulations, but OSHA itself takes a very hands-off approach. And, I think as to, the Doge or whatever it is that, that non-governmental effort that Ramaswamy and Elon Musk are, going to be heading up. Are there some places where some regulations might be cumbersome for industry and it'd be good for revising those? I'm sure that's true. I'm not terribly optimistic that the Doge and those efforts are going to be so nuanced. I think it's going to be, taking an axe to it more than a scalpel. So I could see, OSHA, there being a number of regulations that would change, that would be more pro-business. Another thing too that we haven't talked about, but touches on a lot of these issues, particularly with the National Labor Relations Board, OSHA, some of those agencies, less the EEOC, but still the EEOC, Department of Labor being another, is the hostility not only of the Trump, incoming Trump administration, but the Supreme Court itself to administrative power. And we've already seen, the court take some action to really kind of rein that in. It used to be, you may recall there was a case that came back. This is a little bit of a inside baseball, but case that came down a couple of months ago now, maybe close to a year ago now, overturning what's called the Chevron doctrine. And that was a doctrine that said, hey, courts, when you're reviewing actions by federal agencies, you were supposed to defer to their expertise, right? Because the idea is that these agencies, they have the experts, they have the knowledge. And so therefore, generally, when they say this is how this should go, this is how this should be interpreted, courts should defer to them. That didn't mean they have to be completely hands-off, but they couldn't start from ground zero. And Supreme Court said, no dice, we're getting rid of Chevron. There's no deference to these agencies. And we've seen efforts where they've already limited, agency power. And if we look at, again, not part of the administration, but certainly high up there in terms of the Friends of Trump list, Elon Musk, his companies, X and a number of others have already brought lawsuits against the National Labor Relations Board, not only challenging specific enforcement, but saying the National Labor Relations Board doesn't even have the power to do this. Like the agency's exceeded its congressional power. And if any of those are successful, it could really hamstring agencies like OSHA, like the National Labor Relations Board, and some other federal agencies.
Mm-hmm. Are whistleblowers, should they be worried?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in the federal government, I think it's going to be the Wild West, right? There are whistleblower protections for federal workers. And, we've seen some instances where, the federal workers have been, well, any whistleblowers, but also those in the federal government are treated horribly when they come forward. And is that going to get worse? Potentially, particularly we see this hostility coming from the administration against federal workers generally. Other areas, I think it's a mixed bag. I think it depends the industry in which law they're going to be bringing an action under. A big one is called SOX, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, that's changed and provided some more whistleblower protection. I think a lot of conservatives and folks in the Trump administration are not a big fan of Sarbanes-Oxley and some of those regulations. So we could see some paring back for protections for whistleblowers. But I think we're going to see a lot more people trying to avail themselves of those laws. What kind of treatment they get from doing that is, going to be anybody's guess. But it's going to be perilous for whistleblowers.
How much power does a president have in making some of the issues that we have already discussed happen? Obviously, there is the power of the pen executive order. We've probably seen, now all presidents have done executive orders, obviously. These are as old as the presidency itself. We have seen more information about it because former President Trump, when he was in office, wielded the power of the pen a great deal, but he was not alone. George Bush did it, Barack Obama did it, and we can go on and on and on. But at some point, executive power in the form of executive orders and employment law only goes so far.
Yeah, he's not going to be able. The Trump administration, you're right, is not going to be able to come in, kind of wipe the slate clean and start over. He still has a fair amount of power, not only with executive orders, but these agencies that we've just talked about are executive agencies, and he has the power to appoint people to them that are going to be friendly to his point of view. So I think we could, he's got a fair amount of power in that regard, because again, a lot of these are, in terms of enforcement activity, in terms of how aggressive or not aggressive they are, that's driven by the executive agency. And, President Trump's going to be the top dog there. You're absolutely right, though, as to underlying laws. Like if they wanted to come in and, let's say change Title VII fundamentally, it's going to be, those sorts of things are going to be difficult, because while they have, unified control of all three branches, as the margin in the House is super, super narrow. So the ability for them to pass, fundamental changes to these employment laws is going to be somewhat limited. And even if there were initiatives that Trump liked, or were there kind of his base wanted enacted, some of these laws have unusual constituencies, right, that don't fall along traditional liberal and conservative lines. Whistleblowers, you brought up one of those. A lot of Republicans like whistleblower laws because they want, particularly for government contractors and for government agencies, because they want to root out what they see as waste within the organization, and they want employees to be able to come forward. So again, those sorts of issues, you can see some Republicans being very supportive. We've talked about pregnancy protections. Again, those could have, you're going to get a lot of Republicans who would look askance at any efforts, I think, to really roll those back. So I think it's going to be, it's going to depend on what action we're talking about, on who it touches. The president's going to have a lot of power to direct the tone and the substance of some of this, but it's not going to be unlimited. And I don't think we're going to see wholesale changes to the underlying law, at least not easily, not with like that very narrow control of the House.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention one of the other promises that we've heard from the incoming administration about federal government workers, civil servants, moving them, and in some areas of management, even firing those who are not loyal to the incoming president or the administration. And I ask a rather historic question. The thing that comes to mind for me when we hear about this is BRAC, the Base Realignment Commission for Military Bases, where and this had gone on. We heard the most about it under the Clinton administration. But that was military. Can the same thing be applied, a BRAC kind of commission, to remove or move federal government workers?
I think the short answer is yes. What form that takes, we will see. But I do think the two things that you've mentioned, they've been not shy about saying that they want to, include more federal workers in what they call Schedule F, which is basically reclassifying them to say they can be, be removed and replaced with somebody who is friendly to the Trump administration. Generally, federal workers, historically have been protected from that, except for a more narrow number of federal employees who are political appointees, who can be changed when a new administration comes in a lawful way. I think we'll see a very real effort to change those laws and make it so that more federal employees lack the protections that they currently have, civil service protections that they currently have that protect them from sort of these political vicissitudes. So I think we're going to see how successful it is. We'll see. I mean, there are already union agreements. There are laws in place. It's not going to be, as you said, a matter of them just coming in and wiping the slate clean. I think we're going to see a lot of legal action, but there's going to be that effort to reclassify a lot of these employees and fire a good many of them. If not, perhaps not replacing them, but if they do, to replace them with people who are friendly to the Trump administration, which could completely change the character of the federal government. We'll see. The second one you mentioned is moving federal agencies. Absolutely, right? They've talked about trying to get rid of the Department of Education, but they've already talked about moving the FBI, for instance, and other federal agencies, to areas outside of Washington, D.C. We've already seen some of those efforts be successful, and I expect that we'll see that they'll have some success in that regard too. I think it'll be interesting depending on where the federal agencies are. I mean, the ones in D.C. are a little easier in the sense that they don't necessarily have a constituency, but there's some federal agencies that are in Virginia, in Maryland, and the members of Congress and the senators like those federal agencies being there and like the dollars that they bring. So we could see some resistance on that level, but I don't think there's any question that there's going to be an effort to not only change the composition and the size of the federal government, but the location of federal government agencies.
I've got 1 minute left. If you're a federal government worker or even in private industry who may be concerned about the changes that are coming, what should you be doing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would talk to you, if you have a union, I'll talk to your union first. They're going to be sort of the vanguard of protecting a lot of these workers. So keep an open channel of communication. I'm sure these unions are already talking to their people about what they're planning to do. And, I'm a little biased in this respect, but it never hurts to talk to an employment lawyer. There are a bunch of a number of employment lawyers, particularly in the DC area, who specialize in representing federal government workers. You don't have to lawyer up and hire somebody in a full retainer, but it doesn't hurt to pay to get an hour consult to kind of see where you stand and take the best efforts you can to protect yourself.
Yeah, without a doubt, certainly a change is going to come, as the song says, and so I guess everyone should be paying attention and keeping themselves kind of girded up as well. Attorney Tom Spiegel, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. I really appreciate it, and we will continue to watch this.
Great. Thanks so much, Harold. It's been a lot of fun.
That is the Daily Drum for this Monday, January 13th, 2025. I'm Harold Fisher.